While Iranian and Israeli ballistic missiles were still in the air on Monday, while sirens were blaring across Tel Aviv, while explosions were being reported in Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz, Donald Trump was on a virtual tele-rally for a South Carolina senator, telling the crowd that America would be declaring total victory over Iran in the next 2 weeks. His exact words, total victory, 2 weeks. And then, almost before the echo of that statement could fade, Reuters published one of the most devastating strategic assessments of any American president's wartime claims in modern history. It quoted 4 analysts and 3 Gulf government sources who had studied this conflict from the inside. And what they said was this: Iran has absorbed the blows while retaining and in some cases strengthening its core instruments of power. Regime change in Tehran? No. The surrender of the Islamic Republic? No. Containment of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile? No. An end to Tehran's support for its regional allies? No. And then came the sentence that should end the victory tour entirely. Middle East scholar Fawaz Gergis told Reuters directly, "This war will be remembered as Trump's grave strategic miscalculation, one whose consequences reshaped the region in unintended ways." That is not an opponent speaking. That is an analyst who has studied this region for decades, and he is not alone. So, in this video, I'm going to show you exactly why the gap between Trump's total victory claim and the reality on the ground is not a matter of spin or politics. It is a matter of verifiable, documented fact. I'm going to go through every single thing Trump said Iran would give up: nuclear enrichment, the Hormuz stranglehold, support for regional militias, the uranium stockpile, and I am going to show you the specific confirmed statements and actions from Iran in just the last 72 hours that make every single one of those claims fall apart. And then I'm going to tell you what this actually means for the next 2 weeks. Because Trump set a deadline, and that deadline now matters more than almost anything else happening in this conflict. Let's start with the nuclear claim, because this is the most dramatic one, and the one Trump has been most publicly confident about. At the tele-rally on Monday, Trump said, "They want to make a very good deal. They're willing to give us everything. They're willing to give us no nuclear weapon." That is an extraordinary claim. Iran willing to give up its entire nuclear program. No nuclear weapon, everything on the table. And it sounds powerful until you look at what Iran's own officials have said, consistently, repeatedly, and without any ambiguity, about exactly this issue. Iran's head of the Atomic Energy Organization has stated on the record that Iran will not accept limits on its nuclear enrichment. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Majid Takhtravanchi said explicitly, "If the US is pursuing the goal of stopping Iran's uranium enrichment, then the work will not go ahead. We will not back down on the enrichment issue." Iran's foreign ministry has said the uranium stockpile will under no circumstances be transferred anywhere. And the new Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who took over after his father's assassination on February 28th, issued a standing directive that the enriched uranium stockpile must remain on Iranian territory. That is not a negotiating position. That is a red line issued by the supreme authority of the Iranian state. Secretary of State Rubio, in Senate testimony on June 2nd, laid out the U.S. negotiating structure with more clarity than Trump ever has. Rubio said the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is a predicate that opens the door to Phase 2, in which Iran would commit to negotiations on the disposition of its highly enriched uranium and agree to severe and long-term limitations or cancellation of enrichment activity. Notice what Rubio said. Phase 2, a future negotiation, not something agreed, not something Iran has committed to, a phase that has not even begun. It can only begin after the strait is opened, which Iran has not done. The IAEA chief Rafael Grossi said just days ago that access by IAEA inspectors to Iran's nuclear facilities remains limited, and Tehran continues to determine which sites inspectors can visit. That is not a country giving up everything. That is a country that has not even allowed full inspection of what it already has. Trump also said oil prices will come tumbling down after total victory. That claim deserves exactly the scrutiny it takes to fall apart. Oil prices are sitting at $93 to $95 per barrel right now, elevated, stressed, and sitting just below the $100 level that triggered global supply warnings when it was crossed earlier in this conflict. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed, not partially closed, not gradually reopening, effectively closed with shipping traffic at near standstill. The Brookings Institution published data this week showing that the IEA now estimates oil output from Hormuz-dependent countries is down more than 14 million barrels per day, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. And as of Monday, the Houthis declared a complete and total ban on Israeli maritime navigation in the Red Sea, threatening the second major maritime corridor in the region simultaneously. Oil prices will come tumbling down. The market is watching both choke points and pricing the risk accordingly. It is not tumbling. It is barely holding below $100 on the assumption that a deal gets done. If that assumption breaks, the trajectory is not down. And then there's the proxy network, the thing Trump and his administration say they degraded and curtailed. On Monday, the same day Trump claimed total victory in 2 weeks, the commander of the IRGC Quds Force, the organization that runs Iran's entire regional network of allied groups, publicly announced the formation of a new resistance security belt, stretching from the Strait of Hormuz to the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. He praised Yemen's Houthis for their missile attack on Israel. He said if necessary, others will join. He said borderless fighters are watching your transit choke points. That is Iran's proxy network not only intact, but publicly announcing a new expanded operational framework. On the same day, Trump claims they have given up everything. Iran's crude oil exports fell 84% in May from the previous month, according to Lloyd's List reporting. The U.S. naval blockade has been economically devastating for Iran. There is no question about that. Since April 13th, CENTCOM has disabled 7 non-compliant vessels, redirected 134 ships, and allowed 42 humanitarian vessels to pass. On Monday alone, a U.S. fighter jet fired into the engineering and steering space of the Palau-flagged tanker MT Maravex after it attempted to bypass the blockade and sail to an Iranian port. The economic strangulation is real. Reports from inside Iran describe rampant inflation and unemployment. The blockade is working as an economic weapon. But here is the critical distinction that the total victory framing deliberately obscures. Economic pressure on Iran and strategic victory over Iran are not the same thing. Iran's economy being damaged does not mean Iran has surrendered its nuclear program. Iran's oil revenues falling 84% does not mean Iran has opened the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's infrastructure being bombed does not mean Iran's government has collapsed or lost control. The Reuters analysis put it precisely. Iran's leadership remains firmly in control, even though the country's economy is in tatters and great swaths of infrastructure lie in ruins from American and Israeli bombs. The ruling establishment is described by analysts as more brutal and more empowered than before, not less. Iran controls Hormuz. Iran continues missile and drone production. Iran's regional militia network is not only intact, but publicly announcing new operational frameworks. These are the facts on the ground, and they do not resemble total victory. Now, I want to walk you through the specific things that happened in the last 48 hours that make the 2-week timeline Trump set on Monday look not just optimistic, but structurally impossible, given where the negotiations actually stand. Secretary Rubio's description of the deal structure requires 2 phases. Phase 1 is the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and a broader ceasefire framework. Phase 2 is the nuclear negotiations. Iran's enrichment program, the disposition of the highly enriched uranium stockpile, long-term limitations. The U.S. Congress added another constraint that is not negotiable. A letter signed by 52 senators and 177 House members explicitly demanded no enrichment in any Iran deal. No enrichment. Not reduced enrichment. Not enrichment under supervision. No enrichment. Iran's position is that uranium enrichment is non-negotiable. The congressional position is that no enrichment is non-negotiable. These 2 positions cannot both be true in any deal that gets signed. And the 2-week clock Trump set runs out before either position is moved. There's also the $24 billion problem. Mohsen Rezaei, a military aide to Iran's new supreme leader, told CNN last week that any U.S.-Iran peace deal depends on Washington releasing $24 billion in frozen Iranian assets. He warned that renewed fighting would push the United States into a dark corridor. That $24 billion demand has not been publicly acknowledged by the Trump administration as something they are willing to do. The gap between what Iran is demanding and what the U.S. has publicly offered is not a gap that closes in 2 weeks, with missiles still in the air and both sides claiming the other violated the ceasefire. And then there is the Vahidi factor, the element of this conflict that the critical threats analysis flagged as the decisive internal Iranian political dynamic. The Critical Threats Project published an assessment last week that stated Iran's hardline faction, led by a figure identified as Vahidi, and his inner circle has gained the upper hand over proponents of a deal, including Iran's parliament speaker Ghalibaf, who had been the most visible pro-negotiation voice in Tehran. Vahidi's faction calculates that the status quo serves their interests, solidifying Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz and maintaining the Iranian nuclear program. In other words, the faction inside Iran that does not want a deal is currently winning the internal Iranian political argument. And the events of June 7th and 8th, Iran firing ballistic missiles at Israel, Israel striking back, the Quds Force announcing a new regional security belt, all of those events strengthen Vahidi's argument domestically, not weaken it. Every Israeli strike on Lebanese territory that Iran can point to as a ceasefire violation makes the hardliners stronger inside Tehran. This brings us to the most important question that nobody in the mainstream media is asking directly. If Trump's total victory claim is this far removed from the documented reality, why is he making it? There are two possible explanations. The first is that Trump has information from back-channel negotiations that is not yet public, that Iran has made private commitments that have not been confirmed in any official statement, and that Trump is previewing an announcement he expects to make within 2 weeks. This is possible. Trump-style deal-making often involves public pressure designed to lock the other side into a position before the formal announcement. If that is what is happening, the next 2 weeks would see a rapid sequence of visible concessions from Iran: the Strait opening, inspectors given full access, a formal statement on enrichment limits. Watch for those specific signals. If they appear, Trump's claim starts to look credible. The second explanation is that Trump is making a political statement designed for a domestic audience, the South Carolina tele-rally crowd, the Republican base, and that the 2-week timeline is a rhetorical device rather than an operational prediction. Trump has said 2 weeks before in this conflict. The ceasefire announced on April 8th was supposed to last 2 weeks while the two sides finished a deal. The 2 weeks turned into 2 months of grinding brinkmanship that ended with both sides firing missiles at each other on day 100. The pattern of optimistic timelines not being met is now established enough to be documented, and a White House official admitted this week, on the record to reporters, that Trump made a fundamental miscalculation about Iran's willingness to restart the conflict. A miscalculation about Iran's willingness to fight is a miscalculation about Iran's willingness to deal. They are the same analytical error applied to different contexts. Here is what total victory would actually require. Stated in plain terms without diplomatic language, it would require Iran to verifiably end all uranium enrichment on its territory. It would require Iran to surrender or transfer its existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium, some of which is enriched to 60%, approaching weapons grade. It would require Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz permanently and without tolls or IRGC control over shipping routes. It would require Iran to end its financial and military support for the Houthis, Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, and other regional proxy forces. And it would require the survival of those conditions under a government that Trump's own military campaign did not remove from power. A government that is, by every external analysis, harder and more resistant than it was before February 28th. None of those conditions have been met. None of them are on the verge of being met. Iran is not giving up enrichment. It has said so repeatedly. The uranium stockpile is not moving. Iran has said it will not leave Iranian territory under any circumstances. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. Iran's top negotiator said Monday they will defeat the U.S. naval blockade. The Quds Force just announced a new expanded proxy framework from Hormuz to the Red Sea. This is not a country that is preparing to deliver total victory to Donald Trump in 2 weeks. Subscribe and hit the bell. Because the 2 weeks Trump just put on the clock are the two most important weeks in this conflict since February 28th. Either Iran makes visible, verifiable, documented concessions that close the gap between Trump's claim and reality, in which case there is a genuine deal and this war ends, or the 2 weeks pass without a deal, in which case the political and military pressure on both sides ratchets up to a level this conflict has not yet reached. I will be here every day, tracking every development as it happens. I will see you in the next one.